Hej och välkomna till detta veckans avsnitt av Hög av serier som blir annorlunda än vanligt. Vi tar en liten paus efter den fantastiska seriefestivalen som gick av stapeln i helgen och ger istället utrymme till en av våra tidigare medkollaboratörer, Daniel Löf, som var med i avsnitt 87 och pratade om Robert Hickmans olika fantastiska kreationer. Han fick nämligen under seriefestivalen en stund med Faith Erin Hicks som bland annat är animatör men kanske framförallt serietecknare. Hon var här i egenskap av kanadensisk serieskapare eftersom att temat på seriefestivalen var Kanada. Så att jag lämnar helt enkelt över till Daniel Löf och Faith Erin Hicks.
Okay, so let's start here. How did you get into comics? What did you start reading, and what sort of genres did you read?
I probably, like most Canadian children, I probably started reading comics with Asterix and Tintin. They're just so much a part of Canadian culture. You can find them at any library, and that was probably my first comic. And then from there, I moved on to, there was kind of a big gap. There wasn't a lot of comics that I enjoyed reading as a teenager. I felt very attracted to comics as a medium. I really wanted to read them, but there wasn't a lot that was made at the time that was made for teenage girl readers. But eventually I found Bone by Jeff Smith, which was a huge deal. Finally, it felt like I had found a comic that was made for me as a reader. So I just absolutely loved Bone, and I read that for many years. And then now I've moved on to pretty much everything. I read pretty much anything I can get my hands on, mostly through the Halifax Library, which is a great library and very supportive of comics.
Cool. Okay, which Asterix and Obelix comics did you start? Do you remember the specific title or something?
I mean, I read them all, to be honest. Like, there's not that many, really. Like, I think there's either 33 Tintins and probably about the same amount of Asterix. Like, I know those creators lived longer than Hergé did, but so they produced more work. But I read everything. Like, I read all the Asterix. I know I read all the Tintins.
Oh, that's really cool. Okay, specific favorite, I mean, Asterix or Obelix, because mine is Asterix and Obelix in Egypt.
Oh, yeah, Cleopatra. That one's really good with Cleopatra. Yeah.
And I felt very much in love with the animated series.
Oh, yeah.
I loved it.
I think maybe I've seen bits of that, but because it was made in France, maybe?
I think it was made in France. I don't remember the specific production, but it was done some during the 80s.
Oh, okay. It probably was imported to French Canada, and I don't remember having access to it in English-speaking Canada.
Did you read? I heard that you are not a big fan of the superhero genre, or is that wrong?
It's not wrong. I like the idea of superheroes, and I love, if I can find a well-crafted superhero comic, then I'm definitely going to read that. I'll read anything that's good. And there are some that's good. I really liked Batgirl Year One, which was made a few years ago. I'm really enjoying Hawkeye right now by Matt Fraction and David Aja.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's a really good book. Unfortunately, I don't feel like superhero comics are, and I'm using the term very broadly. So the typical superhero comic with, extremely detailed art that, really weighs heavily on a knowledge of past superhero lore. I find those comics very inaccessible for me as a reader because, I don't have a lot of history with the genre. And sometimes I find the art very confusing to follow because it is so obsessively detailed. So it's not that I object to the genre. I don't. I like the idea of superhero comics. It's just a lot of times I don't feel like they're made for me as a reader.
Okay. You started first as an animator, am I right?
Well, I was actually doing comics before I was an animator, but I went to college for animation. I did a 3-year classical animation program at Sheridan College in Ontario. And I thought that would be my job. I never thought that drawing comics would be my job. I never thought that this was a career that I could have. I thought that animation was, the way you could make a living doing art in Canada. So I did animation and kind of drew comics on the side, web comics especially, for about 4 years. And then in 2008, I lost my job in animation and was able, through a series of events, to kind of transition into doing comics full time. It wasn't necessarily... Initially, it wasn't necessarily my plan. It was just a really long spell of unemployment where I just could not find work. And finally, publishers came and wanted to hire me to do comics. So it was like, well, I'll just continue to do comics since they're the ones that want to hire me. And we'll see where this goes. And that was nearly 6 years ago.
So it basically, you got into comics because of a love of it, and basically needs meets ends basically.
Yeah, I'd say that's correct. I started writing and drawing comics just because I wanted to read a certain type of story that I felt like that was not being told in comics, and I just fell in love with the medium, really. My very first comic was a web comic called Demonology 101.
Yeah, I was going to ask about you about that. You, as you said, your web comic, you started it in 1999?
Yes, back in the dark ages.
Oh, dark ages.
No social media, no Facebook, no Twitter, no Tumblr, none of that. So I just started when I was in school, and I did it because the comic is, initially at least, at the beginning, it was kind of a straight up ripoff of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, like kids in high school. Oh,
that's awesome.
Yeah, and like supernatural stuff's going on and everything like that. I actually met Joss Whedon at San Diego Comic-Con last year.
Oh my God.
Yeah, basically. No, I know. That was my reaction too. My editor at Dark Horse introduced me because she knows him. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you were the reason that I do comics, because I wanted a Buffy the Vampire Slayer comic. And he kind of looked at me and was like, okay.
Oh, that's amazing. I hear about people meeting other people.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I wish I could be you right now.
Yeah, no, it's I don't know. I've met quite a few of my artistic heroes. I've met Jeff Smith, who's really, really awesome. And it's always very overwhelming and just really awesome to, meet this person who inspired you and be like, oh, you are the reason I am doing comics.
Okay, my other question is, I have basically no clue about the Canadian comic scene. Could you explain more about it? What sort of genres is in the Canadian comic scene, and how thriving is it, basically?
Yeah, I feel like we've been having this discussion a lot in Sweden this weekend, trying to pinpoint what exactly is the Canadian comic scene. There are Canadian publishers. There's Drawn and Quarterly. There's I've worked with a Canadian publisher that typically they're called Kids Can Press, and they typically work with like picture books, and I did a young readers comic series with them called Bigfoot Boy, but they typically skew very young. Whereas Drawn and Quarterly more focuses on some adult readership. I think they publish some books for younger readers as well. I'm not quite sure. I feel like the Canadian comic scene is maybe a little hard to define. I feel like there are just Canadians who are cartoonists, or that's my perspective. Like I work a lot with American publishers, so for me it's sort of maybe comics are more of like a North American thing rather than just a specifically Canadian thing. I'm just a Canadian that tells stories, and that happens to be in comic form. So I don't know if I necessarily have a particularly prominent Canadian identity. Like, I don't know, maybe I feel like when people think about Canadian cartoonists, they think about like Brian Lee O'Malley or Kate Beaton, people whose work is specifically set in Canada, that is, maybe very distinct. People perceive it as being very distinctly Canadian. I don't know if they perceive themselves that way. Sorry, I guess this is my way of saying I don't know. My very long and convoluted way of saying I'm not quite sure what the Canadian comic scene is like. I know there's lots of Canadian cartoonists, and I don't know. We all work for a variety of publishers, both Canadian and American. It's nice having that option, certainly.
So it's basically very mixed between different genres and themes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would say, yeah. Like I mean, I know Canadian cartoonists who work in superhero comics. I know people who do autobiographical comics. I know people who do. Yeah, like every genre, really.
Okay, so my next question. You've been in the debate about the fake geek girl, and the theme of this festival is representation. How do you think about the whole fake geek girl thing and women's role in comics? How has it become worse? Has it become better about representation and how to portray women and women in comics? What's your whole comment about it?
I'm actually really glad that this debate is going on right now. I feel like it's about time. I think it's certainly a huge issue, and my perspective is it's gotten a lot better. Growing up, I was very interested in comics, and I really craved comics. And I remember as a teenager, very young teenager, like 13 or 14, going to a comic book store in my hometown, which was a very small town, and it was like the worst comic book store. It was like the stereotypical, gross, dark, you'd go in and you just, I was immediately worried about, being like molested or something, which is a horrible thing to say. But, this was my perception as a very, young, shy teenager who just desperately wanted to read comics. It was not a welcoming place. And, I would go in to buy like X-Men comics, and then I would leave. And, nothing truly horrible happened, but I still felt unwelcome. And it feels like nowadays, pretty much I feel very, as an adult female reader of comics, I feel very catered to by most publishers. I feel like there is a broad diversity of comics being published now that was not available when I was younger. And I find that very encouraging. So you have publishers like First Second, like Drawn and Quarterly, like Fantastic Graphics. Well, Fantastic Graphics has been around for ages, but I feel like there is Scholastic as well as now publishing comics. I feel like there is more work being published now for a wider readership than there was like maybe even only 15 years ago. And that's really incredible to me. Like last year, I've begun keeping track of how many graphic novels I read over the course of the year. And last year I read over 100. And most of them I felt were pretty good. And I would say like maybe 0.5% were superhero comics. And I feel like superhero comics are still kind of a problem.
Yeah, there is a lot. I mean, we have in the superhero genre, we have Gail Simone and Kelly Sue DeConnick, who are prolific female writers who write also really good comics, but it still it's very male dominated. It
is, but yeah. I guess for me, like my problem with that is I feel like superhero comics, especially in North America, people have this idea, a lot of times people have this idea that this is all of comics, that superheroes are the only genre that exists within comics. So like I will constantly read articles on the internet that talk about the lack of representation of women in comics and, the horrible representation of, female bodies within superhero comics. And I feel like that's very problematic because you're basically looking at one tiny subsection of comics and saying it's really horrible for women in this tiny subsection of comics and this needs to be improved. And yes, of course it does. But I feel like you need to look, if you're going to critique comics and, say that comics have a problem with women, you need to look at all of comics. You need to look at what is selling on the New York Times best-selling list. Like a friend of mine, Rena Telgemeier, she has had one of her books, Smile, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 100 weeks.
Whoa, that's amazing.
Like, that's incredible.
Yeah, that's
And yet,
really
this is something that I just never see reported on in comics. This is a woman who has written and drawn this graphic novel, Smile, and yet whenever I see these articles about the representation of women in comics, a lot of times they exclusively seem to focus on the representation of women in superhero comics, and I don't see Rena mentioned. So that is kind of an issue for me. And yes, of course, there needs to be a larger representation of female creators within superhero comics, but I don't know, like it's kind of this frustrating thing where I feel like sometimes the work of women is, because they are not working within this one genre, is sometimes shoved to the side. That's not to dismiss the work of Gail Simone or Kelly Sue DeConnick. These women do fantastic work, but there are many, many women who do comics that are, outside this genre.
You scored some huge point for me when you commented on the whole Todd McFarlane and Mark Millar commenting about the comics aren't for women.
Yeah, that was really silly. Those guys.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, just saying that. When you hear such things that you want to write more comics when such a dumb thing is being said about.
Oh yeah. Like it's It's very strange, and it's a little sad to me when sometimes, like I remember there was a discussion recently, a live discussion with 3 older male comics creators, Todd McFarlane, Len Wein, who created Wolverine, and I believe Jerry Conway, who is most known for killing off Gwen Stacy. And with the exception of Len Wein, these men put forth the opinion that comics were not political. They were they basically followed the path of society, which I don't really agree with. If you look at the history of comics have been very political, from comics like Fantastic Four and the original X-Men to comics that happen nowadays. And comics are art. Comics are things that push forth certain ideas into society, or at least in my opinion they do. Some people might find that silly, but I just, every time I see people kind of saying, spouting these opinions and talking about how comics are not for women, it's very silly. I guess that's the only thing I can say. It is very silly, because comics are not, it's not this special thing that was created specifically for guys. When comics first started being produced and mass produced in the 30s and 40s, comics were made for girls as well. There were tons of different comics made for girls, and I don't know. I just feel like only people who are completely ignorant of the history of comics could have these opinions.
You also made The Adventures of Superhero Girl. Can you tell me a little more about that? Because I kind of missed out on that.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can actually read it online for free. Just Google, or you can find it on my website, faitherinhicks.com. So The Adventures of Superhero Girl, I actually did it as a strip for my local weekly newspaper, The Coast in Halifax. And I did it for 2 years. And Dark Horse has now released a color collection of all of the Superhero Girl strips, which is awesome. It's a beautiful collection. I absolutely love it. Beautifully colored by my colorist, Chris Peter. And, Superhero Girl was basically me looking at the superhero genre and thinking, how would I make a superhero comic? So I like the idea of superheroes, but, as I said earlier, I don't necessarily like the execution used to write and draw superhero comics. So I just basically decided to make my own superhero comic. And Superhero Girl she's someone in her very early 20s. She's, kind of down on her luck. She has a crappy job. She doesn't have a lot of money. She, lives with a roommate, and she has superpowers. And it is she just wants to be a superhero. It is something that she feels like she needs to do. And she goes out and fights crime, more or less, in Canada, and tries to help citizens.
Oh. All right, I will definitely check it out.
Yeah, it's very silly. But
was it also Eisner nominated?
Yes, 2 Eisners.
Oh.
Yeah, which I'm very excited about. I'm going to
2
San
comic
Diego.
Oscar nominations.
Yes, exactly, comic Oscars.
Okay, the first time I found out about you was through Tor.com, where you did a bunch of extremely funny and
thank you.
talented reviews. How did you get in contact with Thor, and Thor is basically a science fiction publication. So do you have any relationship with science fiction?
Tor is part of Macmillan, Macmillan is the publisher. So I have a lot of books. I have 3 books published with First Second Books. And First Second is the graphic novel imprint of Macmillan, which is a large publisher in the States. And Tor is their science fiction imprint. I think they have many, many imprints. But Tor is, I think, one of the most well-known. So I was just invited to basically do some reviews and some other silly little comics for the site. And I did them for a while. I think for about a year. Maybe I did I don't know, maybe 10 or something like that. But they would like me to do more, but I just don't have time. But yeah, so it was, I went to see Prometheus and I reviewed it in comic form, which was really silly.
That's what was the reason I found out about you. Because when I started working at the local comic store 2 years ago, I on my first day off, I went to see Prometheus, and I realized that it's a very stupid movie.
Oh my gosh, it's so dumb.
It's so dumb, but I still got some kind of enjoyment out of it. And then I found your review of it, and basically you pointed out every single wrong thing with it. And then it was the Hunger Games review.
Yeah, I reviewed that, yeah.
You also did a review of the movie and the book.
Yeah, I did, actually. I read the books, and I really enjoyed the books. I read a lot of young adult fiction, and I feel like Hunger Games was kind of my gateway into that, no, it's not a genre. I don't know how even... That category, I guess. Category, yeah. So yeah, I did reviews of both of them for Tor, and I did, you know, I prefer to review stuff that I'm excited about, you know, so Tor, towards the, you know, the later part of our relationship, Tor, I was basically asking me what I would like to review or what I would like to do comics about. So I did one for Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that one because I just binge watched for 1 month basically the entire Avatar series.
Oh, fantastic! I love that
I know.
Series. Yeah,
judging from your review, you're a big
I
fan.
love it so much. Yeah, and that was actually really cool because I did that comic, and I wasn't really on Tumblr at the time. It was before I got a Tumblr account, and one of the creators of the show, Brian Knitzko, saw this comic and you know, basically emailed me to ask permission, if he could put this comic on his Tumblr, and I was like, oh my gosh, you know, so excited. And I actually, so he put it on his Tumblr, which was fantastic. And now I am more on Tumblr. And yeah, I actually got the chance to meet him when I was at San Diego last year and hang out with him and just be like, oh my gosh, you know, I love your work so much.
Yeah,
it was really cool.
Yeah, I want to ask you, why is Toph your favorite character? I mean, yes, he is really, really awesome, but I like my Cabbage's guy more.
You like who? Sorry?
My Cabbages.
Yeah.
He's the most funniest
I feel like with Toph, like, I really wish I had Avatar in my life when I was like 10 or 11 years old, because, you know, growing up, I was a huge tomboy, and I was, you know, there aren't very many characters like that in fiction, or not visual fiction, I guess. So things like movies and television and comics, there aren't really many like tough and, you know, like tomboyish type girls, and I wish I'd had the chance to watch a show with a character like Toph on it, you know, when I was that age, because I felt like, you know, being a young nerdy girl, there wasn't a lot of stuff where I could look at it and see myself represented. So, you know, she just became, you know, watching that show as an adult, she became a very important character for me.
One thing that I really liked about Avatar is, well, of course, the writing, which is basically genius.
Yeah, the writing's amazing.
And the animation, my God. I mean, from your
really
animator standpoint, animation standpoint, I mean, what do you think about the quality about that?
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what kind of budget this show has. I heard they have a really huge budget, but it's incredible. You know, the acting is incredible. You know, there's one thing that I guess animators talk about this, but people maybe outside of animation don't know about it so much, but it's the quality of drawing. So, you know, every time there is a character moves in an animated show, there's a number of drawings that are, you know, made to make that character move. And Avatar has the highest quality I've seen of drawing, and those characters are really hard to draw. You know, they're hard to draw consistently, and that's the most difficult thing in animation, is to draw these characters consistently. So I'm just always blown away by it, the way that these characters are portrayed.
You also made the Avatar comic you talked about on. As I saw it on Thor, it was in anticipation of Korra. Right? What do you think about Korra? Because I heard from other Avatar fans and some of my friends too that they're not as satisfied with Korra. What is your opinion?
I like it. Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine. I think with Korra, I think a lot of people are perhaps disappointed in it because it is not Avatar. You know, I mean, it is a different story told about different characters. It has a different approach to the world that these characters live in, and, you know, it's set a number of years after the events of Avatar. It's also a more difficult story to tell. It's, you know, a story with more moral complexity. You know, Avatar had I don't want to say it's a basic story. That seems very dismissive. But, you know, it's a very traditional story. It's a story of good versus evil. It's Aang versus, you know, the Fire Lord at the end, and it climaxes with a giant battle. Like that's
a very Campbell.
Yeah, exactly.
Thing.
The hero's journey, exactly. Like it's a story that is very traditional, whereas Korra is perhaps a more difficult story to tell because there are no obvious villains in Korra. So I am perfectly fine with it. I watch it. I enjoy it.
You also had you published a comic about your San Diego Comic Con trip.
Oh yes, yep.
And when you met Josh Whedon and all
yep,
that.
Yep.
But you had a point in the comic where you basically told how important Friends with Boys is, and I have read the comic, but can you tell me more about it? I mean, why is it so important for you, as you said in the comic, and what's it about? And is the comic biographical at some point? And
yeah. It's so Friends with Boys it's a graphic novel that I had published by First Second Books. It came out in 2012. It's probably my most successful work. I think it's one of the things that people most know me for. It really varies from person to person. Some people know me for about a variety of things, but just from a sales standpoint, that's my most successful work. So it was the first comic that I did that was a little bit based on. I used my own life as a jumping off point, and I'd never done that before. So Friends with Boys is about a 14-year-old girl going into public high school for the very first time, and she was homeschooled up until this point in her life, and she has 3 brothers. I was homeschooled until high school, and I also have 3 brothers. However, the main character in Friends with Boys sees a ghost, which is not something I have experienced. Like nothing in the book is literally true. You know, I didn't have punk friends in high school. The main character makes friends with these 2 characters who, you know, are basically punks. And like none of the actual occurrences in Friends with Boys happened to me, but it's a book that I consider to be emotionally true. So it's emotionally true to that particular period in my life.
Okay, Alien. I want to talk about Alien.
Okay.
Did that movie have, a huge impact on you, and with the recent death of H.R. Geiger? I mean, can you comment a little bit about Alien and what it meant to you?
It's hard to say. Alien is one of my favorite movies. I don't know that it had an impact on my work. Like, I think if it did, it was probably, again, you know, as I've mentioned before, the representational thing of, you know, having a woman in this kind of movie and having that woman be a character and eventually the hero of the movie. Like, initially, when you watch Alien, you don't think she's going to be the hero. You think Ripley is going to die and, you know, the captain is going to be the hero, because, you know, he's the strong dude, right? You know, with the beard and everything like that. So I feel like in that way, it probably influenced my work and, you know, probably had a huge impact on me. I will say one thing, like, Alien is one of my favorite movies, and I have a couple other favorite movies. Like, I really love Silence of the Lambs, and I really love John Carpenter's The Thing. And those are movies I really, really like, but they exist in genres I am actually terrified of. Like, I'm not a horror person at all. I do not like the serial killer genre. Like, those genres really, really scare me. But because these particular movies are so good, I feel like they transcend their genre.
Okay, let's see. I have so many questions.
No, go. Ask them all.
Okay, you did a tie-in comic to The Last of Us. Do you play a lot of games like Last of Us, or and how did you land the gig with Naughty Dog and all?
Oh, well, what basically happened is I was working for, well, not working for, but Dark Horse was publishing my collection of superhero girl comics. And the writer of The Last of Us, the writer of the game, Neil Druckmann, had read Friends with Boys, which, I mean, I was kind of astonished by, you know, the writer of this incredible $40 million video game read my book. Yeah, I was very astonished. But Dark Horse had approached Naughty Dog about doing doing a tie-in comic for The Last of Us, and Neil had apparently submitted a list of creators he thought might be appropriate for the tie-in comic, and they knew the tie-in comic would be about Ellie, this one of the characters from the game. It wouldn't be about Joel. It would be about Ellie, and my name was on the list of creators they were interested in. So I basically pitched, and I drew some pictures of Ellie, drew some pictures of The Last of Us world, and got the job based on that, which was kind of amazing. I used to be huge into games, back in my late teens through my mid 20s. I was just loved games and thought they were amazing, and really think, and I still think that, I think that there is a level of engagement that you get in a game that's incredible, and I feel like the potential for story there is really, really interesting. I mean, at this point in my life, I'm lucky if I get to play one game a year, just because the reality is once comics kind of take over your life and comics become your job, it really doesn't leave much time for anything. It's a little sad, I kind of don't have much of a life. But so most recently I played the HD remake of Wind Waker, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, which was incredible. Oh my gosh, I love that game so much. It was exactly what I wanted to play at this point in my life.
Last question then. You have a very distinct style. I mean, I can point out this is a Faith Erin Hicks comic. I saw that your influence is of mainly manga. So I mean, Full Metal Alchemist. I'm
a big fan. Yeah,
and Naoki Urasawa.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more? How did you get into manga? Why is that your main influence? And what other influences?
Yeah.
Basically?
I think now, I don't know not quite sure how to explain this. So I actually got into manga very late. And I'd been drawing for quite a while when I got into it. I probably didn't start reading it until 2008. So if I started making comics in 1999, I'd been nearly making comics for 10 years before I got into manga. For some reason, there was a big manga boom in the early aughts, and, a boom that was really facilitated by female readers. Finally they were being given works that they wanted to read, given books that they wanted to read, which was very cool. But for some reason, I kind of missed out on that. I didn't have friends who were into manga. Most of my friends were mostly into comics. So it took me a really long time to get into manga. But when I started reading it, and especially when I started reading Naoki Urasawa's work, he is the creator behind Pluto, behind 20th Century Boys, and Monster. Monster was the first manga I really read and really got into. I finally saw what I was trying to do in comics. And, for a long time, I'd been sort of limping along in comics and trying to work a certain way and to draw my comics in a certain decompressed style that I didn't quite understand. I feel like it was probably more influenced by movies, and influenced by how I saw movies made. And when I saw Naoki Urasawa's work, it was sort of light struck my brain, and I was like, oh, finally, here's someone who's doing what I've been wanting to do the whole time. So from that point on, I feel like my work shifted a lot and became more influenced by manga. I don't think my work, and I'm actually very grateful for this, because in Canada and the US, people are very publishers tend to be very biased against people who draw in manga style. And I don't think my work identifies as manga. I don't use the same tools, I can't,
but there is a certain, style to it, but it's not, it's.
I would say it's probably more influenced by animation, because that's how I'm trained. I would say my paneling style is perhaps very manga influenced, but I wouldn't necessarily say that my drawing style is. And my paneling style and probably my style of decompressed storytelling. But yeah, it's kind of funny, people, I will occasionally hear this from people where they'll say, well, your work is very influenced by manga. You read a lot of manga, which is funny, because I don't feel like I do read a lot of manga. I read the most that I can, and I'm constantly looking for a new series. I love Full Metal Alchemist. That series is my absolute favorite of anything in the world.
I haven't read it or seen the anime yet, but I will.
I highly recommend the manga. I feel like both of the anime series do not achieve the level of greatness that the manga does. The manga is incredible, and the story that it tells is so dark and so rich, but at the same time full of such humanity and full of such humor, I don't, for whatever reason, that just did not translate very well to the anime. So I highly recommend the manga series, not necessarily the animes.
Okay, I will get to it as fast as possible then.
Right away.
Right away. All right, but I think we will close the interview here, and thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Och tack så hemskt mycket säger vi till Daniel och till Faith. Vi kommer tillbaka med ett vanligt avsnitt nästa vecka, och däremellan kan det vara så att det dyker upp först och främst ett videoavsnitt från seriefestivalen på vår YouTube-kanal, men också även en recension av den nya X-Men-filmen som jag och Freddy kommer ha varit och sett. Och kan bli en YouTube-recension av den också. Så att håll ögonen öppna efter allt det, och som vanligt, läs mer serier!